And I think that my understanding is that we have got plenty of questions through Slido. So I'll give Robert and John a very quick 2 minutes to say what you need to say very briefly, and then we'll go straight into the questions.
I think I can almost go straight into the questions. Simon talked about being at a decision point in the south when it comes to TB, and we're in a very similar place in the north. We've had our TB Strategic Partnership Group sit. We had the report in December 15. Without ministers, exceptionally, we went out to consult. 200 replies came in, and not backs of envelopes replies, large substantive replies and suggestions about what we should do, which we're now in the process of putting together. But very soon I'll have all that work completed and a piece of work where decisions need to be made. And I'm a public servant, I don't make decisions. Decisions are for elected representatives. And I'm getting to a place where I'm in a real bind, and we have to try and work our way through this. Avoiding politics, I'm a public servant, but I don't think anybody in the room thinks we're going to have a local government in the next few months. But I'm in a place where I need to move this programme forward. I need to show leadership, I need to show direction, but very difficult to do without starting to make some really, really key decisions. And that's where I'm at. And it's not that comfortable a seat.
Thanks, Robert. John?
I'm in a position where we have a dairy farm, but we're also down currently with TB. I mean, and one of the things that I think has to be, we have to move forward. We're still dealing with a disease with the same reaction, restrictions, etc., that were in the early 60s when herds were small herds, mixed herds. We have specialised herds now, whether it be beef breeding, dairy, beef fattening, and it causes multiple, as large herds actually cause difficult problems. And actually, I think if we're going to deal with everything, like some of the suggestions Simon made, we have to actually have a new look at how we actually deal, because you can't deal with biosecurity on farm, which is very important if you're vastly overstocked. And certainly, I mean, that's one aspect I think we have to look at in the future, how we actually deal with that and make sure that the diseased animals that are on farm are kept on that farm, but also allow farmers actually to run their business where their resources are not overstretched. I think that has to be all part of the package, and there is a work to be done between DAERA, farmers and other interested bodies to work together in this, not actually to try to do their own bit in isolation. DAERA and veterinary service are testing, and they find the disease, full stop. The farmer's left with the consequence. We have to all work together if we're ever going to get anywhere in this disease.
John, thank you. We're going to move into the question. I hope everybody has been voting in the way that you've been instructed, and that will allow us to take the questions in order of the importance that you place on them. I'm surprised that I've got so many shy people in the room tonight. We have a lot of anonymous questions, so we can all try to work out. We'll go with our first question. Should Northern Ireland move straight into vaccination policy in wildlife instead of a cull policy? And maybe I'd ask Simon to comment initially on that. What, based on what you've seen in the south, what should we do here?
The evidence that we have in terms of the concept of vaccination is that vaccine really will only be effective if the prevalence of infection is quite low. And the problem is, in a non-culled situation, you can, well, we in the south have had prevalence of infection up to 40 or 50%. So the approach that we are taking is that vaccination is only being rolled out into areas where we have a lot of confidence that the percentage of infected badgers is low. So generally, culling has been ongoing for some period of time prior to vaccine being rolled out. And I think it would be fair to say, I might pass to Andrew, but I think it would be fair to say that the international consensus in the scientific community at the moment is that vaccine really needs to be implemented into what we define as low prevalence populations.
I guess adding to that, like I'm making a case for evidence base. Trials in England and in the Republic of Ireland have very much been measured at the badger level, so that's just something to be aware of. So vaccination has shown to be important in the context of badger populations, and while there are modelling, there hasn't been any really, there's no real evidential base for the effect of vaccinating badgers on local cattle populations. In contrast, if you look at the international evidence base from the randomised badger cull trial in Britain and the trials that have gone on in the Republic of Ireland, the outcome in those interventions were very much at cattle risk. So in terms of just pure evidence base, I think the argument would be that that culling really is the best, it's the only really recognised evidence base we have in terms of reducing risk, albeit with a lot of societal and stakeholder issues around that approach. The second thing I would say is that some of the modelling that we had undertaken, and I would agree with Simon, that essentially vaccination works best when you have low prevalence, and as some of the work that we highlighted there, essentially it's not an all or nothing. So I think there would be arguments in the literature to say that you could go in and cull a population initially to try and reduce prevalence if that works, with some caveats, and then followed up by growing a vaccinated population. So it's not really a binary outcome, I would argue, and I think there is a space there that stakeholders can engage with and still have a positive outcome.
Okay, Robert, yeah.
So this is a classic example of evidence-based policy making, where we have a question, which is a real question that's facing folks like me in policy making, and we look to the science. But one of the things I can almost guarantee with every science to do with TB is that there will be a contrary view. The TB Strategic Partnerships Group's recommendation on wildlife was for a cull with a vaccinated donut around the edge to try and prevent any effects of perturbation. And that's on the basis that our population of badgers is currently too high, and the level of infection is too high for the vaccination, given the evidence we have, to be effective. But what you have is science hitting policy and then hits politics. And we may end up in the science of the achievable. And that's the sort of conversation that we've had through the consultation, and where we're trying to come towards a conclusion on this. So it's a real cutting edge, front level. These are the big decisions that need to be made.
I'm going to move on to the next question. We bring John in to start on the next question. It's a really important question given Brexit and given the impact. So what impact will the level of TB in Northern Ireland cattle population have on our ability to export cattle post-Brexit? It's only a year away. John?
Well, certainly, I mean, the level of TB has been continuous rising over the last period of time, and it's certainly having a big impact. And certainly post-Brexit, our reputation actually for having animals with disease, when quite a lot of our trading partners either hasn't had the disease or had eradicated it, leaves us at somewhat as a disadvantage. So certainly, I mean, it's something that I think everybody would like to see us move to reduce the level of TB in the cattle population, right across all the stakeholders, from government, farmers, industry, etc. I think it's something that we urgently need to try and have an impact on. And as Simon said in his presentation, there's a point of time when decisions have to be made, and I think that point of time is now, and we have to really actually grab the bull by the horns and start to do something radical to try and reduce the level.
Thanks, John. Simon?
Yes, if I could just take that a step further and perhaps bring an Australian perspective. If the UK essentially floats off on its own in terms of trade, I think it becomes somewhat similar to where Australia has been for many years. And the whole motivation for eradication in Australia was entirely driven by trade, and the view that to get competitive advantage you needed to be TB and indeed brucellosis free. So I think the pressure will be greater outside the EU than in, because inside the EU, Ireland, for example, or indeed the UK to this point in time, has been able to trade without too many problems. But I think it will get more challenging. I think that's fair.
Okay. Robert?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways this works. Currently, as part of the single market, other parts of the EU more or less have to take our agricultural products. But every certificate, either for cattle or for cattle products, be that beef or be that dairy products, starts with a declaration on TB. And one of the things that third countries can use as a non-tariff barrier to trade is animal health, along with public health. And it will be used. Best example is our bull calves we currently send to Spain. Spanish CVO already has told me he won't be taking them. Currently he has to. The reason for that is that I write to him every other month and tell him, you know the 2,000 calves you took last week? Well, they were okay last week, but now I know they come from infected breakdown herds, so you better go and test them, putting a cost onto him and his administration, sending him disease. So, in his position, I would do exactly the same thing. I wouldn't be taking them or demanding higher standards. And, you know, this is when you know who your friends are. CVO Scotland, TV meeting yesterday. She was describing her 13 outbreaks last year, 2 of them in pigs, 11 in cattle. That's 11, not 11%, 11. 2 of which we sent her. We sent her biggest one. She's very pleased about that. Will those marketing Scotch beef be commenting on the disease status on the island of Ireland? I'd even be as bold to say. But certainly in Northern Ireland, sitting at 9.41% herd incidence at the moment. If I was marketing Scotch beef and I was trying to talk about the high health status of Scotland, I think I might have a little aside that talked about Northern Ireland. We have to do something.
Okay, it's a point well made. If we come to a next question now, and it's can you kindly describe the practicalities of implementing a badger vaccination programme, i.e. identifying animals, age of badger, is it a booster needed, etc.? Andrew?
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. It's a large question. Currently, if you look at what type of essentially research-based vaccination programs that have gone on, and then some programs, almost citizen science programs in England, essentially they're predicated on capturing badgers, which is not a simple process, as you could imagine, and then generally speaking, injecting BCG within those animals. At very large spatial scales, that's going to be probably inhibited by cost and practicalities. So there's quite a bit of research trying to develop baits that are stable and that are, I suppose, favourable to badgers. The problem with that, of course, is that there needs to be ancillary data around looking at how stable BCG would be in the I suppose in the environment, also other hosts who may ingest them. But ultimately that would be the goal. But right now it appears to me the only practical aspect is the capture and vaccination type of approach. So essentially what you need to do in those kind of circumstances is that you need to have an underlying survey to try and identify sets and where badgers may reside within the landscape, which can be costly and time consuming, obviously. Once you identify key areas where you might want to target, then you need to put out, in the Republic of Ireland, to use stopped restraints, which is a wire restraint that catches animals around the torso, generally speaking. But it's not favoured necessarily in projects going forward within the UK. And so in that case, you capture badgers literally with cages, which is quite logistically challenging as well. So once you capture the badgers, obviously then you need to vaccinate them, so you need BCG. The administration of that is generally done under the supervision of a veterinarian. So you need a veterinarian on site, it's another challenge. In terms of looking at the population, and really for vaccinations to work, you need to have high coverage, which can be challenging. Essentially, you need to capture a lot of the badgers that are locally resident. In terms of aging of badgers, there are some ways that we can do it by looking at their teeth growth, but generally we can categorise them and their weight, of course, into cubs, yearlings, adults, and older animals. In terms of booster needed, it's a little bit of a grey area, but generally speaking, in programmes that have gone on so far, if a badger is caught multiple times, they generally get one vaccination dose per annum. That's some of the practicalities. I can discuss the challenges, and I'm not sure if that really addresses the question, but that's really the basic setup.
Simon and then Robert. Yeah.
Just briefly, I know there's experience building here, but there's been a lot of experience in the Republic as well in terms of badger vaccination. And there's now a national program. It's focused in about 7+ counties. But I do know there's huge cooperation, and the folks in the south, as indeed the folks in the north, are really keen to work together on this. So it's really a matter of seeking to learn the lessons from mistakes in other countries. What we've found has worked or hasn't worked hopefully will be useful for you, and it works both ways.
Robert?
And I can confirm that's the case. In fact, when it comes to all research money is used as well as we can amongst all the countries that make up the United Kingdom and Ireland to make sure we get the best value for the research, the scarce resources that we put into research. The work that my field staff did in TVR has built up a lot of expertise. We went to Wales, we went to the Republic, we learned the lessons there. And the first thing you do is you identify the areas where you have most likelihood of success. And as you know, we've done that in Northern Ireland with an area at Achadue, one at Omagh. We've been out and we've sampled the badgers. We've established that they have the same serotype as the cattle in that area, which is important for a legislative step. And currently, staff are out on the ground identifying the badger sets so that we could go forward with an intervention programme as soon as decisions were made.
Okay, if we'll move on to the next question now, and I maybe ask John to comment initially on this, but should we be looking at including the trait for TB resistance into cattle breeding indexes as part of an overall eradication solution? John?
Yes, the information certainly in the Holstein societies are available actually, and TB resistance score is actually in there where people are using, and I think a lot of people are actually making use of that. The trouble with that, it is a long-term breeding. Breeding itself is a long-term aim, and the impact will help, but it'll take a number of generations before it will actually have any sort of an impact. But it's certainly something that's worthwhile doing.
Okay. Any other comments on that, Simon?
Yes, I think it's fair to say I'm sure many of us are looking forward to what Donna, Barry and colleagues will speak about this shortly. I've always had I think the answer is absolutely. It has the potential to be extremely helpful. I've always had a concern, are we breeding for resistance to TB, or are we breeding for essentially reduction in reactivity to the test? And I know that Donna and colleagues have been thinking about this in great detail and are confident that it indeed is breeding for resistance. And if that's the case, absolutely, it has the potential to be very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, Simon, thank you. I think if we move to the next question now, it's actually very important. It's absolutely essential, and I think the CBO painted the picture as to how we must get this right. But what are the main difficulties you foresee in TB eradication in Ireland, North and South?
It would be easy for me to give the flippant answer politics, but actually that's not the case. The biggest difficulty that we have, and the one that the group identified, is a change of culture and a change of way in looking at disease right across all the actors involved in this game. You know, it's getting back to the basics. This is a bacterial infection. It's a disease. It's not a program. It's not a government issue. It's not something that government are forcing upon the industry. It's something we have to do together. And we have to see this as a disease, you know, in the light of other diseases that farmers are trying to deal with. And we have to deal with trying to eradicate this disease, and yes, eradicate this disease in partnership. Nobody can do this on their own. And I feel when I'm out talking to farmers, and I talk to a lot of farmers groups, that there's a real hunger to do something about this now. That, you know, my predecessor, Bert Houston, always used to say, don't miss a good crisis. Well, I wouldn't like to describe this as a crisis because it would make a good headline for the Farm Week. But we've got to a position where everybody wants this out of their way so they can get on with farming.
I mean, I would have to agree with, in this case, everything that these Robert has said. But the one thing that I think is actually missing in all this is there is a divide between the farmer and the veterinary service and the vet. They're actually very good. The veterinary service is very good at finding disease, but a vet should also be involved in trying to source where the disease came from and try and eliminate. And I think once the disease is found, it's left far too much to the farmer's responsibility then and disengagement. I think there need to be a lot more communication and engagement between the veterinary service and farmers.
There probably isn't much that I could add to what I've already said. I do see, though, that the difficulties, there's certainly technical difficulties, but there's also quite fundamental policy/political difficulties. For example, we speak about wildlife. Technically, I think there is a way forward. In terms of cattle, there is a way forward, but there's really key political decisions to be made. And then in terms of governance, I can only speak for the South, but really I think there is a need for really a real rethink in terms of governance. At the moment, TB is considered absolutely to be a government problem. We'll never get rid of TB if it continues like that.
I'm just going to move on to, we probably have time for this one last question, and obviously we always want to learn from where there has been success, and we heard about TB being effectively wiped out for the better part of 2 decades in Australia. So can that Australian model of only selling and buying to higher, lower risk herds work in Ireland with our livestock markets, or will markets have to be avoided? So you want to start, Simon, and then Andrew?
The Australian system is quite similar to here. We talk about sale yards rather than marts, but the sale yard plays as important a social role in Australia as it plays a mart plays here. So there's substantial movement of animals through sale yards there, and that continued the whole way through the BTEC program. So of course I guess there is some risk associated with animals contacting in marts or in sale yards, but it's relatively low. I should state though, and this in a way highlights the fundamental commitment from the livestock industries, and it was driven by the imperative of trade, is prior to BTEC, there was movement of stock progressively from northern Australia to south. And BTEC changed that fundamentally. So all of the trading patterns had to change as a result of BTEC. Because TB was so much more difficult to eradicate from the north, those animals were riskier, so they couldn't come south where those herds were free. But there was risk-based trading that continued within regions. It was something that farmers really came to grips with very quickly. And I would suggest it would be much easier to implement here because the computer systems are much more sophisticated here than they ever were in Australia. So I don't see the market, the marts or the sale yards as being a major concern. Of course, there are issues that would need to be thought through, as indeed would the whole issue of, well, how do we classify herds according to risk? If we are genuinely going to move herds through a risk-based categorisation system, we need to do it in a way that is puts as little commercial impact as possible. People need to continue to trade, of course.
Yeah. Andrew?
I probably speak more from the technical and scientific underpinning of such a proposal. I think before that could be implemented, there's quite a job of work to be undertaken on the research side, as Simon has alluded to. It's not a trivial thing to rank herds in terms of risk, and really to do a system justice to ensure getting maximisation of such a proposal, it needs to be based on real-time data and analyses. So it's probably feasible even at the animal level to start talking about risk. For me, I think the liberation of data onto the markets is possibly not a bad thing, and then allow the markets to adjust necessarily. So not necessarily a regulatory or a top-down system, but as a first step, at least allowing farmers to make some conscientious decisions about risk, I think. But just suffice to say that that needs to be underpinned by a very strong evidence base, I think.
Yeah. And I think it would be remiss of me not to leave the last word to the CVO on something like this. He's going to implement all this on our behalf.
A very interesting area about which actually we could talk about for a long time. The TB group, I'll put his name to it, Campbell. Campbell was very keen on risk-based trading. Been to New Zealand, seen the Australian-New Zealand type system, 10 years of freedom before you're properly clear, and can be considered to be a TB really free herd. And we looked at everything we could look at in Northern Ireland as far as evidence available was concerned, and we really couldn't work out what information a farmer could genuinely use when your incidence is 10% to identify a lower risk herd than in others. We really struggled with it. Particularly when you think of the statistic that Simon gave you, that your clear test that has just been cleared, had a recent test, had 2 clear tests, 10 to 15% of them break down, 12% I think is the figure at the moment in Northern Ireland, break down at their 6 months test. Where do you go from there? And on the movement, we tried that as well. We tried to think about things around movement as well. You saw the spider's web that Simon put up and the data that Andrew had. That's only the movements we know about. We've got this wonderful thing called Conacre, which is recorded in nobody's database. If you're trying to create a system to move disease around a country, no better one could you invent. But we have it. And the market bit, the evidence isn't there. But if you think about it, you take cattle, you stress the life out of them by taking them for a run in the trailer, and then you mix them with other animals. And one thing we do know is that animals are more likely to be susceptible to spread of disease when they're stressed. Usually when I'm finished giving talks like that, people wonder how we stand still with the controlled program, never mind make progress. But I'm not going to get depressed. We can make forward steps with this disease. I see down the list there, eradication is a realistic aim. And it's maybe not within my working life, but maybe the next CVO or the one after. And it's something that absolutely we must aim at. Control is not good enough. Eradication is the aim.
Look, I'm very and you can see there's loads of additional questions on the screens there, and that we had more time. We have another 2 topics to get through the course of the day. That's been a really useful discussion. I think the importance of getting this right as quickly as possible has been very well stated. We have got excellent science to back up Robert and his team in the policy decision making, and we know that the policy has got to be made as quickly as possible and implemented. So say a very big thank you to our panel today.